Tim Bayne, welcome to Sweden.
Thank you.
You've written a book about thought, the nature of thought, Tänkandets, natur in Swedish. What is a thought?
That's a great question. Even having written the book, I'm not sure I can really answer it.
That's the kind of question you can ask kids and you can get very funny answers.
That's right.
But now I'm asking a professor in philosophy.
That's right. Well, I can give you some distinctions. And I think when you think about a topic, one of the first things you want to do, the first thing we often do is make distinctions. And when you're thinking about thinking, that's precisely what one needs to do, I think, make some distinctions. The distinctions themselves won't give you a full theory. If we had a full theory, I would have presented it in my book. If I had a full theory, I would have presented it in my book, but I don't have it, and I don't think anybody really has a theory of thought. But what I do in the book is make some distinctions, point to things that some of us think might tell us something about thinking, and then point to things that we really don't understand. So let me give you a couple of distinctions just to start this conversation. So one thing we talk about when we talk about thinking is a faculty, a mental faculty. So in the way, if you think about the body, there's the heart, there's the kidneys, there's the liver, different organs that do different things and operate in different ways. You can think about the mind as composed of different faculties that perhaps have different jobs, that operate according to different principles. And it's natural to think that one of the faculties is a faculty of thought, in the same way there's a faculty of memory or a faculty of perception. So that's one thing, and maybe we'll come back to that later perhaps. So you can think about thinking as in terms of a faculty. Then there's thinking as an event or a state. So we can perceive something. If you and I are outside on a beautiful sunny day, we might see the ocean. That would be a visual experience. But
we maybe don't think about the ocean.
But maybe not think about it. And right now we're not looking at it, but we can think about it. We just did, right? So somehow our thoughts are able to latch on to something that's a mental event that you and I have. And
that we don't perceive.
We don't perceive. And in the case of the ocean, we can perceive it. We often do perceive it. But we can think about things that are imperceptible. Black holes or all sorts of numbers, the number 3, all sorts of logical, mathematical objects, simply imperceptible. And then there's thinking as a process. So when Sherlock Holmes solves a crime, he engages in a process of thinking about who must have done it and where the evidence points. And when a scientist comes up with a theory or evaluates a theory, they do the same thing. And in daydreams, you associate, you go through a stream of thoughts, not perhaps logical in the same way, but there's a process of sort of quasi-thinking in daydreaming. So those are 3 distinctions which I think are, or 3 types of things that are associated with thought. There's the faculty, and there's the event, mental state or mental event, and then there's the process. So that's a start. It's not a theory, but it points us.
I see. When you say daydreaming, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, psychologists call this, their term for daydreaming is mind wandering. So if you're on a train, I find myself daydreaming on trains. I think I'm not alone. You're sort of in a reverie. Your mind goes from one idea to another idea, to a third idea. And in fact, this happens surprisingly common. I mean, one of the things that psychologists have discovered in recent years is we spend a lot of our time off topic, right? Even when you're reading a book. I'm not talking about you, but people in general, you sit down and you think, oh, I have a nice quiet evening to myself. I will read this book. And if at some point later that night, while you're supposedly reading the book, someone buzzes you and says, what were you thinking of right now? Well, you may have been reading a book, but your mind might well have been wandering.
That's interesting. I was asking about daydreaming because the other day my 7-year-old son said to me while I was driving the car, he said, "Dad, I just learned to daydream."
Wow.
And I asked him what he meant, and
Yeah.
he said, "Well, I'm dreaming with my eyes open."
Yeah.
And he couldn't explain it better than that, but obviously he meant something that he was thinking about something outside of the car.
We can learn a lot from kids, can't we, in the way they express ideas.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so there are lots of commonalities between dreaming and daydreaming. And I think that's one of the... This is right now, this is a very active topic of research in psychology, the nature of daydreaming. It's the way, one way to think about it is thinking that's not direct, it's not focused, so it's not oriented around a particular problem that you're trying to solve, and it's not directly engaged with your environment.
But it's still thinking in your terms.
In a broad sense, I'm happy to call it thinking.
Okay.
It involves a sequence of thoughts. But what's interesting about it is it's different from, as it were, thinking through a problem like a Sudoku puzzle, or how to construct some IKEA furniture, or how to build a house, where it's as it were, it's not guided in the same way by trying to solve a problem. So it involves it's thinking in the sense it involves a sequence of thoughts as opposed to perceptual states, but it's not guided in the way that thinking is often guided. So some people would want to reserve the term thinking for things that aren't daydreaming, but I'm happy to have a broader... Why not? Okay,
but with your terms, your terminology here, could you name some kind of mental processes that you would not call thinking?
I guess I would... all of the mental processes involved in perception would, I think, not qualify as thinking, and not just in my way of thinking about things, but I think in the way philosophers and psychologists generally draw a contrast between perception and thought. So recognizing something wouldn't count as thinking. Having said that, there's a debate about the nature of the boundary between perception and thought. So I think in ordinary language, my impression is that we generally assume that there's quite a sharp contrast between perception and thought, that the faculties are quite discrete. But it's not clear that that assumption is right. Some philosophers would defend it. Other philosophers, and I think many psychologists, certainly many neuroscientists, would think of the transition from perception to thought as a gradual one. And you've got jazz over here, you've got rock in the middle, you have jazz fusion or jazz rock, and certain musicians, is this jazz or is this rock? Well, it's hard to say. And that's the kind of picture that some people might have of the relationship between perception and thought. And other people would say, no, there's a clear boundary. You're either perceiving something or you're thinking about it.
Would you say that thinking requires rationality, or could you be thinking irrational?
Well, that's a great question. That's a really good question. So here's what I'm inclined to say. I think that there's a minimal, very minimal sense of rationality that is perhaps required for any kind of thought. And if there's no rationality whatsoever anywhere in the picture, then it's hard to make a case that you've really got thought. So what I don't want to say is you have to be perfectly rational to think. I don't want to say that. So I was quite careful about how I put my view. Because we're all irrational much of the time, and many psychologists have built careers showing that that was systematically irrational. Another reason to be very cautious and very careful about the relationship between thinking and rationality is thinking about psychiatric conditions, especially delusions.
Yeah, schizophrenia and
schizophrenia,
paranoia.
That's right. And these are, by definitions, I think, conditions where rationality is impaired. There may be some kind of rationality there, and that's a very interesting question, what kind of rationality.
I'm thinking that you could argue that given that you accept the axioms that such a person holds, the reactions could be rational. I mean, if you accept that there are voices telling you what to do in your head, otherwise you will be punished, then you can act rational according to that.
That's right. So I think one of the things that we've really learned in recent years is that it's possible to make a lot of sense of a lot of delusional conditions, and a lot of delusions that are common in schizophrenia. And that if you understand the ways in which the person's psychology is being changed, and in particular, as you suggested, if you understand their perceptual experience, the nature of the voices, the abnormalities and perhaps their feeling of bodily control, and the kind of control they have with their thoughts, then perhaps it's perfectly rational, or at least, I shouldn't say perfectly rational, perhaps there's a kind of rationality in the response. So I think that's right. Things get more interesting when you look at some of the delusions that you see in someone like John Nash, the famous mathematician
who died quite recently. Yeah,
that's right. And so he exhibited sort of florid, or what are called polythematic delusions. So, for example, at one point, he thought he was, I believe, the left foot of God, or the emperor of Antarctica. And here it's harder to see what the rational context of this sort of thought would be. And some people have suggested that when you have a speech act, when you have an utterance, where you can, there's no, even being extremely generous, there's no rational framework that you can bring to bear on this speech. Then at that point, we really can't say there's a thought there. Because thought inhabits, it requires for its existence a kind of framework of rationality. I'm attracted by that idea, but it's problematic. I mean, it's controversial, let's put it that way.
Do you think animals have thoughts?
I'm going to make a response which I hate, but it depends what you mean by thought thinking.
Okay, yeah.
This is a classic philosophical response, and it's a terrible one, but there you have it.
Yeah.
In a sense, yes. In a sense, no. So, one characterization of thought which I very much like is the one given by the philosopher and scientist and mathematician Descartes, René Descartes, who described thought as a universal tool that can be applied across a wide range of situations. I'm paraphrasing a little bit from the French. Now, when you approach thought from that angle, do animals have thought? Well, they can reason creatively about a range of topics that are distinctive to their ecological niche. So baboons, for example, appear to be capable of, as it were, making judgments and inferences about social relations in their troop. That's important for them. It's important that they work out the hierarchy and who's a dominant male and who's a not. Crows can manipulate information with respect to constructing tools to retrieve objects and food sources. So within certain niches, animals can clearly engage in inference and reason. So thinking, I mean, in a sense that we were talking about before.
But can they reflect on reflecting?
Perhaps not. At least we don't, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have clear evidence of that. No. So they're not able to take a step back and think about their thoughts, think about their thought processes. That seems to be a uniquely human trait. Perhaps language is required for that. And their capacity to think about the world seems to be relatively restricted to domains. So one way to think about animal thought is within a certain domain, for example, social relations for the baboons, or how to construct tools for crows, for corvids, we might say the animal's thinking. It's inferring, it's tracking causal relations, it's tracking features, abstract features of its environment. So yes, it's thinking. Does it have a universal tool that it can apply to all sorts of topics and see connections between all sorts of features of the environment? Perhaps not.
Perhaps not.
Perhaps
No.
not. So a limited scope.
But you say that probably the animals cannot reflect on reflecting, as far as we know. I mean, animals cannot understand that they see themselves in a mirror, I guess. At least not dogs and cats.
I think my understanding is that dogs and cats can't. It's the evidence on the mirror self-recognition is mixed. I believe. I haven't followed the literature closely, but I think most great apes can't. I think there's been some studies on dolphins, and I think dolphins can. I think elephants may be able to pass mirrored self-recognition.
Because humans develop it, I think, in the second year or something like that.
Yeah, around about 18 months. That could be right. That could be right. But I mean, what weight to put on that isn't clear. You need a certain sort of, to recognize yourself in the mirror, you need to map the object that you can see in the mirror. You have to understand how mirrors work.
Yeah.
You need to map that object that you can see with your sort of representation of your body. That's an interesting skill, and it's interesting to ask why some species can do that and other species can't. But it seems to me that one could engage in all sorts of thoughts without being able to do that.
Okay, I see what you mean. The concept of theory of mind, could you help me explain that? What is that?
So theory of mind, in the broadest sense, so the way most people use that phrase, is the capacity to detect, understand other people's mental states.
Yeah.
This is something that human beings are incredibly good at.
After like 3 or 4 years.
Well, what's interesting is the classic results from, I guess, the 80s, the early 90s, suggested that really mature theory of mind kicked in about 3.5, 4 years of age. Recent research in the last 5 or 10 years has suggested that there's a lot of theory of mind understanding in very young infants. So the age has been pushed down, and even 6-month-old babies show a lot of sensitivity to other people's mental states. Exactly how to understand this data is controversial, but the age has been going down and down and down.
So could you say that theory of mind means that you have the capacity to understand that you believe something even though it might not be right? You believe something about reality which I know is wrong, but I realize you think it's right.
That's right. So one of the classic tests for theory of mind, or a classic central aspect of theory of mind, is the false belief task, which is the capacity for me to realize that you believe something which I think is false. So you might have seen food being placed in this bowl. Then you leave the room. I see the food being moved somewhere else, but then the bowl is covered up. When you come back into the room, will I realize that you have a false belief about where the food is? Or will I assume that since I know where the food is, your beliefs will track reality?
That's a way to test for autism, isn't it?
Well,
for kids.
Well, my understanding is that theory of mind is certainly delayed in autism. So, I mean, autism is a complex syndrome and has different aspects. But the classic finding is that there's certainly theory of mind impairments, and that people on the autistic spectrum will typically develop the capacity to understand the false beliefs typically later, and in some cases, I guess, with severe, if they're severely autistic, then they may not develop that capacity at all. But those who develop it are typically developmentally delayed in understanding.
But to have a theory of mind requires thought, don't you? Wouldn't you say that?
I would say that there is actually an interesting debate about whether we can perceive other people's mental states.
Perceive?
Yeah.
In what sense?
Well, you can see fear in someone's face, in their facial expressions, surprise, happiness. I mean, you may not just need the face, you may need an environmental context. I mean, there'd be very interesting studies showing that just in terms of facial expression, many very different emotional expressions produce the same facial expression. So sadness and happiness, can both produce tears.
Yeah.
But we see, once you give someone a context of a party, you see they're crying for happiness. It's a surprise birthday party or something. So some emotional states, we may have perceptual capacities to detect them, but certainly false belief, like we were talking about before, and many other aspects of the mind do require thinking. So one thing human beings are very good at is thinking about other people's mental states.
Yeah, yeah. Your research right now is about how to measure consciousness, right?
That's right.
Like in people with brain damages and so on.
That's right.
How do you know what to measure?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah,
that's the question.
Tell me about your research.
Well,
research.
So one of the big challenges for consciousness is how do you measure it? How do you validate measures of consciousness? And can you even do it? So how do you go about doing it, and is it even possible to do it? So a lot of people are spending a lot of money with things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, brain imaging.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of very sophisticated neuroscience going into theories of consciousness and measurement of consciousness. But it's not clear how you move from information about someone's brain to information about whether they're conscious. So we know that after a coma, even when people who are not behaviorally responsive, so you ask them to move an arm or you ask them to open their eyes, no response whatsoever. We know there's lots of neural activity in these patients. What we don't yet know, we don't really have good accounts of how to move from information about that activity to whether they're conscious. Now, one question is, how do you go about measuring something without a theory of it? There's a sort of a paradox here, because to develop a theory of something, you need to be able to measure it. To measure something, you need a theory of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Catch-22.
There is a catch-22, and it's a very deep methodological problem. But one reason for optimism, if you focus on the catch-22, you can become a pessimist overnight. You think, this is impossible. We could never really scientifically measure consciousness. But one reason for optimism, at least I see it as a reason for optimism, is that we've encountered a problem like this in other parts of science. Mm-hmm. So think about the development of thermometers. We didn't really have a good theory of temperature for many, many centuries, thousands of years. Nor did we have good ways of measuring temperature. To develop a theory of temperature, you have to measure it. To know how to measure it, you have to develop a theory of it. So developing ways of measuring temperature, to see the problem, we now know that mercury is one way to measure temperature. But how do you know whether your thermometer is broken? Right? Or how do you know that the movement of the mercury level in the thermometer is correlated with the thing that you want to measure, temperature? So developing ways of measuring temperature, the scientists who are concerned with this problem had exactly the same problem that we have in consciousness.
So you're an
but
optimist.
somehow They solved that problem.
Yeah.
Because we can now measure temperature.
Yeah. That's true.
So one thing I want to do in my research is look back over the history of science and look at other areas like development of temperature and theory of temperature and say, well, how did they somehow find the way between these two, the two horns of the Catch-22? You develop a provisional measure and then a provisional theory, and you use the theory to get a better measure, and you use a better measure to get a better theory. You go back and forth between the two, and you it's like sailing, I guess. You tack from one side. I'm not a sailor, but I think that's, you understand. You understand where I'm going.
Not a sailor either. but okay, but for example, do you think that we ever could create consciousness in a computer?
I don't see why we couldn't.
It's theoretically, principally possible.
Well, we don't know much about the real underlying basis of consciousness. So I certainly think we're not in a position now to say that we can't. The research, the question I'm focused on is, how would you know whether you've got a conscious computer? You know? What sort of tests would you run?
The Turing test.
Well,
he solved it by saying that if you can't distinguish it from human, then you have it.
So Turing gave us one place to start. Not everyone's happy with his answer.
No, that's true.
But that's a proposal.
John Searle, for example, is not happy about it. So the Chinese rule.
Searle's not happy with that proposal. I mean, strictly speaking, Turing was focused on the question of whether we can make a computer that thinks.
Yeah.
And, you might say, well, thinking is one thing, consciousness is another. So the relationship between thinking and consciousness is itself a very interesting
But I guess you would say that consciousness is required for thinking?
I'm tempted to say that, but if you ask me for an argument, it's very hard to come up with an argument.
Thought without consciousness, that's interesting.
Well, so one...
Consciousness without thought, we see quite a lot.
Consciousness without thought seems to be viable. That's right. That's right. Sometimes I myself am guilty of consciousness without thought.
Well, we all are.
Thought without consciousness is a very interesting possibility. I mean, you might look at the last 5, 10, 15 years of developments in AI, and you might think, I'm not saying this is the right idea, but it's an understandable proposal, that we're moving closer to thought and not necessarily moving closer to consciousness.
One last question, and you probably can't give a clear answer because nobody knows, but I still want to hear you speculate on how come that there are unique persons who have such extreme mental talent, like, for example, this English guy who remembers 22,000 decimals of pi, for example.
Yeah.
Or other super geniuses who can do certain things. How is that? I mean, they all have the same brain as we all have. Do you have any idea of what that is?
I don't have any idea.
No. Aren't you interested in studying that kind of person?
I think that's fascinating.
Because maybe you could learn something about thought by looking at these extreme examples.
I'm sure we can. No, I'm sure we can. I mean, one of the challenges of thinking about thought is, on the one hand, there's lots of reasons to treat it as a single faculty. A faculty where we can sort of integrate various aspects of the world, our knowledge of one aspect of the world with our knowledge of another aspect of the world. On the other hand, there are reasons, and the kind of conditions that you talked about are prime examples here. There are reasons to think, well, there are very important differences between different types of thought. I mean, we know that some people have an expert mathematical mind. We have other people have an expert capacity to compose music. So we know that there's, as it were, domain specificity in thinking. And there's a tension in thinking about thought to navigate between these two ideas. On the one hand, some people have an amazing expertise in this very narrow area. Where they can see connections here, but perhaps their other aspects of thought are relatively undeveloped. But we don't want to fractionate thought completely, because then we lose the sense that it's a single organ that enables us to understand the world and to see connections between different things. So there's a tension, there's a constant tension in thinking about thought between cutting it up into different faculties. Musical thought, mathematical thought, and holding those capacities together and thinking of them as the operation of a single faculty that enables us to see connections between different parts of the world.
Last question. What do you think is the closest breakthrough in your research field? What will you achieve that you would define as a breakthrough? The closest breakthrough.
The closest. I thought you were going to ask me about the most important breakthrough. The closest.
Well, you can answer that too.
Well, the most important breakthrough would be to really understand the relationship between thought and consciousness. I think this is the thing that, if we had a good answer, if we had a good conception there, we would be a lot further along.
But what will happen in the near future?
What will happen in the near future? I think it will be very interesting to see how we as a society respond to artificial agents that are able to engage with us in the way that you and I are engaging with each other. So I mean, for me, this will be absolutely fascinating. When the Turing test or something like the Turing test becomes a reality.
That will happen soon.
And when it happens, we will need to make decisions about legal issues, about moral issues, about issues of employment. I mean, very basic issues that we're really not theoretically equipped to make at the moment, I think. We don't have a theoretical framework for understanding what sort of distinctions matter here. I mean, does it matter that someone is able to have this conversation in the way that you and I are, or whether they're able to have the conversation in the way that, say, an Android that's made by Google in 15 years is? I mean, clearly the mode of operation will be different. The hardware is going to be different. The principles of computation will be different. Are those differences that matter? Should they matter? In what way should they matter? We don't. I think we're not prepared. We don't have a framework for thinking coherent.
We need a new ethics for that, probably.
We need a new ethics, and we also, well, we need a new philosophy of mind. The ethics has to be informed by a philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
So, but certainly we need a new ethics.
That's maybe your next book.
Could be.
Thank you, Tim Bayne.
Thank you so much.